Hello, everyone. Welcome to Rash's World. Today we have a very special event, actually, and very special guest. We're going to talk about Otto Rank and his legacy, and there's an upcoming conference happening online on November 4th and 5th, entitled Unleashing Otto Rank, the Creation of Modern Depth Therapy. And I have two on November 4th and November 5th. And I have two of the speakers here. So welcome to Rash's World, Robert Kramer, as well as Kirk Schneider. How are you doing today?
Good. Fantastic.
Great to have you here. So I'd like to, Robert, if you can start us off here, please, with a brief description of yourself. What is it you do? How would you describe yourself? As well as what you're going to talk about in terms of Otto Rank. What is going to be your focus at the conference?
Well, thank you for the invitation for your webinar. This is my first appearance on your webinar, and maybe only my second webinar in my life. I think I did one on existential therapy about 6 months ago. So I'm a little insecure, but I'm sure you can hold my hand and lead the way. And the word leadership is important for me because I apply Otto Rank's ideas in my capacity as a leadership consultant or a leadership development consultant. In other words, I develop the leadership capacity of senior managers and executives in corporations, governments, and civil society around the world. I have a PhD in leadership from a business school. I am not trained as a therapist, but I found myself so attracted when I was doing my PhD studies, and even a little earlier, to Rank's fantastic ideas on what he called the creative will. And there's nothing more important in leading a company, a government office, or a nonprofit than exercising your creative will to help transform the community which you are trying to change, plus the staff that you are trying to have follow you. In fact, there's no definition I've ever found better of leadership than somebody who has followers. Well, that does not include the ethical aspects of leadership, but that's what leadership is. So I've written, I don't know, 5 books on Otto Rank, or 4 books, or 6 books. Sometimes I lose track because some of them are translated into different languages. And my future or next book will be highlighted at the first International Otto Rank Conference to be held online on November 4th and 5th. Now, Kirk, who I'm going to invite to introduce you to that conference, helped organize it with his Existential Humanistic Institute located in San Francisco. Unfortunately, Siebrecht, our missing speaker tonight, he got caught up in some sort of traffic situation in Belgium. He lives in Leuven, Belgium, and is a professor there. Also sponsors this conference, but Kirk is the one who took the lead. So I'm going to invite him to introduce the conference and tell your audience what it's all about and the fun that they're going to have if they sign up.
Thank you so much, Robert Kramer. And your talk, just briefly, it's called Otto Rank and the Creation of Modern Psychotherapy. That's correct?
That's the name of my book. My next book, published by Oxford University Press next year, it tells the untold story that not Sigmund Freud, not Carl Jung, not Alfred Adler, but Otto Rank actually should be given the credit for creating the principles of modern psychotherapy, which are rooted in the experience of a deeply empathic relationship in the therapeutic situation, about which Kirk knows a great deal. So let me invite him to continue the conversation.
Absolutely agree. Thank you so much. And Kirk, yeah, tell us about it.
Well, Bob, I think you're being ultra modest here in terms of who was the inspiration for this conference. It really was you, as far as I'm concerned, and it was our discussions, our very long-term discussions over many years, but in particular the last several years, where you wrote a book called The Birth of Relationship Therapy, a skinny little tome, which is one of the best books, as far as I'm concerned, on Otto Rank's theory and his therapeutic ideas as well. And there it is. It's Birth of Relationship Therapy, Carl Rogers meets Otto Rank. Is that right?
Yeah.
And basically that book shows that Otto Rank was the founding spirit and voice for existential humanistic therapy, because not only, as I very lightly chided Robert, not only is it about Carl Rogers meets Otto Rank, but it's very much about Rollo May meets Otto Rank. So both of these great humanistic existential pioneers really have their main roots in Otto Rank's theory of psychology, a theory of psychotherapy, and that's what Robert's new book is also about, is tracing the lineage of those great pioneers of existential humanistic psychology to Otto Rank, as well as much of modern depth psychotherapy. Otto Rank's ideas about the foundation for our anxieties, as well as our possibilities and our capacity for wonder, homing in on the birth experience, are absolutely formative to our existential humanistic perspective, and in many ways the contemporary psychoanalytic perspective, where that shift between relative non-being and unity with the mother and with the cosmos, really, we got to open it up because we're talking about a spiritual dimension, not just interpersonal, to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium, makes a lot of sense to many of us as the fount of the template for virtually all future anxiety and trauma, as well as possibilities for creativity, for discovery, for bridge building dialogues among people of very different backgrounds, because it's really, as Rank puts it, about the psychology of difference, how we deal with difference at a very primal level. And so how that infant is met by the parents and the culture is all important. And it, in our view, underlies classical Freudian theory about the foundation for neurosis and psychological health, and even underlies much of the contemporary psychoanalytic emphasis on the interpersonal underpinnings of psychological disturbance and health, because we're talking about one's relationship to existence, as well as to obviously the critical parenting and culture that one comes into, and whether they're met with understanding and support, or met with fear, often transmitted fear over generations, that constricts the child's will, creative will, as Bob was talking about before.
And I want to jump into that and the discussion here because I'm a student of Otto Rank, found him by accident, and just reading from the get-go when he talks about birth and death being the driving forces of us being afraid of death, and a lot of our behavior is explained by knowing that. And I've read only 3 of his books, and I continue reading and learning. But I loved his the latest one I read is Beyond Psychology, where he talks about living psychology. And one of the things is that when we look at psychology, it's not something that's in the lab, that's something that you can study in a textbook. It's alive, it's creative, it has that creative will. And I just love that, because we have various psychologists who are trying to have a theory, which is an absolute theory, and apply it to everyone. And this is how it should be. And that's not how it works, especially the human mind. So looking at neurosis, I like what Rank is saying about that. It just baffles me that how he did not receive the attention he should have because of those brilliant ideas. This was written 100 years ago, and it applies to today's world in many ways. This
Let
book.
me take that one up the baton here.
Yeah.
In a single sentence, Rank said that neurosis is a failure in creativity. I mean, that, in one sentence, he tells you that his whole life mission was to promote the creative life force, the primal life force, as he called it in one of his books. And he was influential, although very few people know about it. In psychotherapy, Carl Rogers and Ronald May, but for many prominent figures in the arts and humanities, they absorbed him. I'm going to give you a list that I compiled for my forthcoming book, which I hope people will wait to read instead of reading the book that Kirk so kindly flacked for me. Wait for the bigger book, because it's going to be much more comprehensive. Here's your list, just a list of the names of people who were deeply influenced by reading Rank. Not one of them ever met him. Here's the list that I compiled, and I have lots of information about each one of these people in my forthcoming book. Samuel Beckett, Nobel laureate in literature. Martha Graham, creator of modern dance. Nella Larson, Black author, famous novelist of the Harlem Renaissance. Anais Nin, Irish novelist.
Yeah.
Salvador Dali, the surrealist painter. Richard Neutra, a very well-known modernist architect in the 60s and 70s. Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique. Henry Miller, novelist. Poet Sylvia Plath, professor of leadership and co-founder of the field of organizational development. Edgar Schein, theologian Mathew Fox, who is going to be one of our speakers. And here's something that will surprise many people. The curators at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. organized a major exhibit in 2022 entitled The Double, Identity and Difference in Art Since 1900. And they based it on Rank's book, published in 1914, called The Double. The double is a theme that comes up over and over and over again in literary criticism. Just 2 weeks ago, or was it a month ago? I can't remember now. Naomi Klein, who is a professor of climate justice in Vancouver, published a book called Doppelganger. Doppelganger is the German word for double. A trip into the mirror world, where she uses Rank's theories to try to understand the strangeness of artificial intelligence, where avatars live, and we find it difficult to tell the difference between reality and fantasy. And of course, the most important name on this list, who really brought Rank back to life in the mid-1970s, was Ernest Becker, cultural anthropologist and a philosopher who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1973 for his book, The Denial of Death. This book, tributes to it have come from scores of prominent people. It was based on Rank and integrated with Kierkegaard. So people like Louise Gluck, the winner of the 2020 Nobel Prize in Literature, Woody Allen, the filmmaker, included The Denial of Death in his Academy Award-winning film Annie Hall. Don DeLillo, very well-known American novelist. And of all people, President Bill Clinton had a copy of Becker's book on his bedside on the night of his marriage to Hillary. So just one quote from Becker's book called The Denial of Death. He says, "There's no substitute for reading Rank. He is a mine for years of insights and pondering.
Yeah.
You cannot merely praise much of his work, because in its stunning brilliance, it is often fantastic, gratuitous, superlative. The insights seem like a gift beyond what is necessary." So that should whet the appetite of anybody watching this podcast to learn exactly why so many people found reading Otto Rank a transforming experience. He was
from so many different disciplines, which is amazing. So many different. It's not just yeah.
It's not
That's right.
psychotherapy. The man is not a psychotherapist. He's a profound philosopher, social critic, and not only that, he wanted social change, and he worked very hard with feminists at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Work to create a new curriculum for social workers to transform the way they treated their clients and to promote social justice and equality and feminism. That's what his psychology of difference was all about. So this man cannot be categorized. He's not a psychoanalyst. He's not a mythologist, although he wrote one of the most famous books on myth called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero. He's not an anthropologist, although he wrote a classic book on the subject called Psychology and the Soul. He's not an art critic, although he wrote the best book on art anybody has ever written, called Art and Artist. He doesn't fit into the ordinary categories that our university departments like to create, dividing knowledge into slices and then prohibiting faculty from crossing lines into the other department. In fact, if you try to be interdisciplinary in today's university, and I have much experience with this, I think Kirk does as well, if you try to be interdisciplinary, you will be disciplined by the professors in the departments who will not appreciate your entering into their territory.
And
So
just to
Ron
jump,
could never get tenure in any university.
exactly.
He
And
was
just to
writing across all lines.
jump into that, and then I want to have Kirk's thoughts as well. But he was disciplined himself by Freud and by all his followers. So in a way, he was canceled from the beginning because
He was
he opposed.
canceled.
He was canceled because he opposed the authority there, and sadly, a lot of people followed suit and did cancel him. And I think that's why he was also did not receive the attention he should have received. And I want to give a quote too, because I really like this quote of changing how therapy should be, and that it's the strengthening of the individual will. And it says, equal right of every individual to become and to be himself, to
Yeah.
accept his own difference and have it accepted by others. We don't want to be the same. We don't want to see everything in the same way. And neurosis as a sign of rebellion, as resistance of the individual against the norms and so on. I just love that because it puts everything into perspective and shows us that we've probably been wrong for decades. If we had only listened to him earlier, we would have advanced much more as a society, as a world, and so on. But I'm really glad that we're unleashing his power now with this upcoming conference next month. So, Kirk, your thoughts on that?
So many thoughts have been whizzing by. Yeah, I mean, you asked about our talks. So my talk is on Rank recasting psychoanalysis in existential terms. I really think that if we would have stayed with Rank, we would have a psychoanalysis that's much more holistic,
Yes.
that's much more universalistic. That's not just about the biases so much of the typical founders of Freud and Jung, for example, although I do feel that they both opened up some very, very important territory in terms of exploding the vanity of the human being and exposing us to subconscious influences. It's just that the way they frame the subconscious seems to have come from to a great extent from their own personal, experiences, biases, cultural backgrounds, etc. But Rank, by focusing on this universal experience we all have, we're all wounded at birth. This is the ultra wound, in a sense, that we all share, and it's cross-cultural, it's cross-individual, and it opens up, as Bob was talking about before, you were talking about, Araj, so many creative possibilities. It's the facing, what I would call the facing of the groundlessness and helplessness of our existence. And ironically, paradoxically, that very groundlessness and helplessness, without the equipment to deal with it, is a horror, is a terror, right? It's overwhelming. And again, forms a template for future anxiety, trauma, etc. But if we can gain the equipment, the tools to work with it, something I call life-enhancing anxiety, which is the capacity to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. If we can acquire that from our parents, from our culture, then we can open up to many creative possibilities for our lives, not restricted by the parental or the cultural system per se, although certainly influenced by it, but a genuinely supportive and understanding context for the child allows for a great deal of inner freedom, both for the individual and the collective, and also a sensitivity to the to the natural limitations of living as well.
And it brings an openness too, of being open, and again, for everyone. Like that's the therapist, that's the client, that's everyone in society. An openness to other ideas, the difference, to individuality, of seeing things differently. And I find like a lot, we're afraid of that, because when we accept a different point of view, we feel attacked by it, and it means that our point of view might not be correct. Our opinion might be wrong. And I think that's the fear, where we have the us versus them, and we see that division because of that. But not to see it as a threat, not to see it actually as a way of enhancing and improving our own views, our own existence, and so on. And I think that's important, but we're missing the point if we want to be right in our way of thinking, without looking at the actual reality of things, and without accepting, like you're saying, that we're vulnerable, that we are traumatized, all of us, through the experience of birth. And we always are traumatized because we are afraid of death. That's something that's looming around, whether we accept it or deny it or not, it's still there. And to come to grips with that, I think.
Yes, I don't think we realize how identified we are with sameness, this need for sameness. And that is just one of the scourges of individual, what we call psychopathology. You know, going the same route, the same routines, staying constricted within those routines, whatever they are, same ideologies, the same dogmas that we stick to. I think this is one of the major points that Rank brings up that is so important, both on an individual and collective level. That we somehow learn how to step out of that box of sameness. Now, it's understandable that we grasp at the sameness because, again, at a very primal level, that's where we were, that's a place that was safe and familiar, right? In the mother's womb, or in the cosmic womb that we emerge from. That is so powerful. And then we're suddenly thrown, as Heidegger puts it, into this wild existence with no moorings, nothing to grasp onto, except the skills that we may be provided from our parents and the culture to navigate. So it's understandable that we grasp at, leveling and sameness in our thinking, in our feelings, etc., our bodies. But it is very destructive for many, many people.
And it's like, yeah.
I would like to ask you
a
question, if I may. I'm very curious. You're so enthusiastic about Otto Rank. You quoted him virtually from memory. How did you discover Otto Rank? What led you to him, and what made you stick to him, and not just see him as another interesting guy, but there's a lot of more interesting people for me to spend time with.
For me, psychoanalysis was fascinating. And I started, I've always found it interesting, but I actually took it for real. And I thought the unconscious is actually real. And it's like something that will help me, not something I read about. And so once I started applying that, my life started to change. My views changed. My whole existence shifted in a positive direction. And then by accident, I found I loved Freud and loved his insight. But then when I read Otto Rank, it's like, this is more correct. He's got it. He gets it, and just his way of seeing things as well. And I like how he also talks about the other thinkers as well, and psychoanalysts, that he compares himself to Freud, who's more like trying to make it a science. He's more like biologically oriented. Jung, who goes a bit too far in terms of mysticism. And I actually have a name for each of the people that I came up with as a game. So it's frivolous, but I think it's useful. Otto Rank's original name was Rosenfeld, so a field of roses. I think that's a beautiful way of describing him. Freud brought joy, the will to pleasure, Freude in German. Jung brought youth and his Jungfrauen. I found out that he did have various mistresses and so on. So that's another aspect. Adler, the will to power, right? That's something talks like the other, the ego. And Frankl, the frank will to meaning. So being open and accepting meaning. I have Skinner in there as a serial killer. Skinner. And myself, hopefully, because Farzaneh, I found out very recently means wisdom. So, so that's what I've played around with. But in more honesty, I think Freud's way of seeing things was limited. That it's very negative. It's like aggression. It's like the goodness is missing. The creativity is missing. And to me, Rank is bringing in artistry, bringing in the creative will of being different and thinking outside of the box. Those are the ones who stand out. Those are the ones we remember, not the ones who are the same, who conform, but those who stand out and oppose the status quo become our leaders, even though we often, and we talk about leadership, even though we oppose them often, but the followers are those, you're a good leader if the followers follow you willingly. They choose. And that's a very different thing than leaders we have today who are like forcing you, or you don't realize that you're being forced and coerced, but it's not out of your own free will that you follow them. It's because of conformity, of pressure, of peer pressure, and so on. And I think that's an issue that we really need to delve into in today's world.
That's right. So Rank, there was no term leadership development in the mid-1920s when Rank started to teach as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Work. The term didn't exist. In fact, well, there was the word leader, but development was not part of that. And his idea was to transform the social workers in his classes into people, and these were almost all women, by the way, who could lead others to lead themselves. And what he was trying to say there was that your clients, poor, disadvantaged, minority, mostly women, have lost hope, have been tossed aside by the rest of society. And yet inside your clients, he said, something that was so radical that the Freudians were shocked. I mean that quite literally. They were very vehemently opposed to what I'm just going to tell you. Rank saw inside his poor, disadvantaged, minority clients, those with different sexual orientation, the energy of life, the creative life force, the primal cosmic life force, he called it. He was always a cosmic thinker. And he taught his social work students first to discover their own creative will, which had not been allowed to be expressed at that period in culture. They were supposed to be passive and just give instructions to their clients on how to fit into society. He said, first discover your own creative energy, your own life force, and then go out into the field and using empathic relationships, listen deeply to what your clients are saying. Carl Rogers first learned about Otto Rank when a social worker on his staff, at that time, Carl was director of child guidance in Rochester, New York, at a guidance clinic. And one of his social workers there, he'd hired a number, had been trained by Rank. And she told him, you know, Otto Rank is not doing Freudian therapy. Rank was living at that time in 1936 when Rogers discovered him, not by reading a book, but by listening to one woman on his staff who said, I had therapy with Otto Rank, and he taught us how to listen deeply. And Rogers was amazed because he had never heard that from the Freudians that he had trained with at Columbia University's Teachers College for his PhD in counseling. And so that's where the idea of active listening or deep listening came from, through a social worker who had been a student of Rank's. At that point, Rogers decided to invite Otto Rank to the University of Rochester for a 3-day weekend workshop where Rank could explain what he was talking, what the social worker had been telling him he was doing. And Rank came, and he did demonstrations of what later, and actually at that time, he was already calling relationship therapy. In other words, how do you build a trusting, mutually respectful, mutually empathic relationship with clients? Both sides were active and engaged in the creation and recreation of each other. This was unheard of by the Freudians, who kept their distance emotionally. At the recommendation of Freud, who had said, treat your patients like a surgeon, which means no feelings are allowed to be expressed. No feelings are allowed to be felt by the therapist in the analysis. So it was a radical shift in Rogers. And Rogers took it and created, to his credit, client-centered therapy, which, and then spent the rest of his life teaching this model, which he later eventually called person-centered, because he moved far out of the therapy realm and into social improvement and help. And Rogers, this psychologists have published articles, is the second most highly cited psychologist over the course of the 20th, clinician, excuse me, over the course of the 20th century. Now, Rank was forgotten by 1960, or actually even earlier, because he had suffered from the cancel culture that the Freudians inflicted on him. And so Rogers is now seen in almost every textbook as the founder, creator of modern psychotherapy. He was, but he himself always credited that weekend, a single weekend, that's 3 days, Friday night lecture, and then Saturday demonstrations of relationship therapy, and Sunday, maybe some more lectures and more demonstrations and a wrap up, just like how we do this. If the APA had been giving credits, CEU credits, they would have given everybody 20 credits for that one, that weekend.
And just to add to that, I think Rank was the original person-to-person therapist.
Yes, uses the term person-to-person in his books.
Yes, I mean, bringing in a sense of love and courage in a relationship versus fear.
He talked about love and will, which Rollo May picked up. Rollo May never met Rogers, unlike Rank, excuse me. Of course, he knew Rogers very, very well. In the 60s, they were very close colleagues. But Rollo May had to make a marriage decision in the mid-1930s, and he went to a therapist who had been trained by Rank in Paris, a man named Dr. Harry Bone, who helped him read Rank, because Rank was very difficult to read. And Rollo was a brilliant thinker and an analyst, and he could take it on all by himself after Bone introduced Rank's ideas to him. And he talked a lot about love and will during his own analysis with Harry Bone. And that's where the seed of the famous book, published later by Rollo in 1969, called Love and Will, was planted in the discussions 35 years or 30 years earlier with his analyst, Harry Bone, who had been trained as an analyst by Rank in Paris.
Just the
Yeah.
term unconditional positive regard, I think that's just magnificent. It's like we should always have that ourselves and not just like imposing things. And Kirk, I wanted to talk about that, about therapy too, because I'm wondering like how many people were like Otto Rank and they got moved away to put on the path again, although their way of seeing things was actually really fruitful and was actually more correct than the status quo, than the social norms. So that in a way, therapy needs, like you're recasting it, we need to look at it in a different way. It's like, let's work with the individual patient and not have a theory imposed upon them, but deal with them. What is it they need? Because Rank talks about like, it depends. You can define it's neurotic if you are suffering from it, you're pretending to be someone else, which most of us are, and we often try to do that. So it's a common thing, but it's not when you are in line and in tune with who you are, your own identity. So of knowing that difference, and it might look neurotic to others, but you say, no, that's just how I am. Like I'm perfectly in tune with who I am. Yeah, creativity, exactly. So how can we shift that? Because I think there's been quite a bit of unintentional damage done through also therapy, where we try to correct things that don't need to be corrected to begin with.
Well, R.D. Laing had a kind of maybe overly devaluing line about his fellow psychiatrists, but I think it has a ring of truth to it, which was many of his colleagues were suffering from what he called psychophobia, fear of the mind. And he illustrated that with the vase face illusion in one of his books, where he says the psychiatrists are focusing on the faces, the Janus face, two opposing faces. They're focusing on the vases, the vase part, the mechanical part, the bundles of chemical and physiological reactions coming together, versus the faces of the Janus face, person to person. So I think this point is very well taken in terms of our field as a whole. We have many ways of working with patients that are unfortunately distancing and mechanizing of the relationship, and don't allow for the beautiful stuff that's underneath, and that, as you say, some neurotics are beginning to feel, but they just don't quite have the courage to open up to it in a fuller, more creative way.
And just to mention, Woody Allen would not exist if he had been treated successfully. Then we wouldn't have his beautiful work and his comedy, right? I think it's like sometimes it can be served to a good purpose. It's as long as he doesn't suffer too much himself from it. But I don't think he does, right? So, as an example.
Yes. So how many people have been shortchanged or cheated by therapists coming at them as a doctor with a white coat who's going to give them the answer, versus a therapist who, as Irv Yalom so eloquently puts it, is more like a fellow traveler at an inn, another weary traveler, a human being who's going to preside by and be present to. Presence is so key to this whole process. Present to the rebirth of the client. The client now coming into a birth, having conditions whereby the client feels safe enough to work more deeply with what really matters about their lives, and be able to be reborn, in a sense, in a way that supports their unique way of seeing the world, their deeper connection with themselves and with others, and also a capacity. I think this is really important: a capacity to reoccupy the parts of themselves that have been blocked off. And that means that primal wound of groundlessness and helplessness to come into greater ground within the groundlessness.
Yeah. And so I think that's the limit. Sorry, that's the limit with Freud, because he's like, once it's like, okay, now you know the truth, now you know what's causing it. Okay, go ahead. good luck. And it's like, no, that's when we actually like, we need this for which way do I take now? The job is not done yet. That's like, that's an important tool, but what comes next? And I like, again, the existential focus of it. What am I going to do with this truth now that I have it about myself? What's the next step? And that's missing often in traditional Freudian psychoanalysis, in my view, is not the truth itself doesn't cure you. You just have to, what are you going to do with it next? That's important, I think.
Yes, that's right. And that's the gentle challenge that Rank and other existential-oriented therapists bring to the relationship. Mm-hmm. Is throughout the relationship, there's a kind of well, there's certainly a kind of inherent press on the patient to not only look at what is really going on for themselves, but how are they going to respond to it? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Responsibility, ability to respond.
And the strengthening of the will of that person, of the individual, the strengthening of it. And it's like, okay, now that you got this, you're going to be fine. But we have to get that. And I think like not everyone does that. And again, traditional psychoanalysis did not necessarily do that. It was like just digging in and again, looking into the past, finding out, okay, this is it. That's it, right? My job is done. Move on, right? No, but it's like, that kind of, I'm going to be fine for the rest of my life if I have that, if I'm in tune with who I am. And I think that will help us as a society as well. Instead of seeing the nations, what Rank says is basically we want to be immortal. And if we identify with the nation, which is a more collective thing, then we can survive. Therefore, the other nation is a threat to the survival of this nation. And so this is just the denial of death happening. And if we take that out of the equation, well, there is no nation and there is no other and there's no other nation. It's just like we're all in the same boat.
Yes.
We all live on a pale blue dot, as Carl said.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
It's impossible to believe the lies of political leaders about the safety that militarism and fences and fortresses are supposed to provide the nation state. Once you see the 3-minute video, which I'm going to show, by the way, during my talk at the First International Otto Rank Conference, for those people who haven't seen it. I've seen it 1,000 times, and each time I see it, I get a chill down my spine. Google, if you want to see it ahead of time, simply Google Carl Sagan pale blue dot on YouTube. 3 minutes will change your life. You do not need interminable analysis, as Professor Freud insisted. You will remember that you are a speck of dust on a infinitesimally small piece of rock that is circling around a slightly larger speck of dust, which we call the sun. That is our existence in the cosmos.
Yeah.
I always like to say, we live in outer space. This is something that is just incredible, but impossible to avoid realizing once you see the pictures that are now coming out from NASA's telescopes. There's one that just came out a month ago or so. I forgot the name of the telescope. Maybe one of you can recall it.
I think it's extra large telescope. It had like ELD or something like that. I'm not sure.
There's a name for it. It's named after one of the first directors of NASA, whose name
forgot his name.
Escapes me. But just click NASA's latest photos or Google NASA photos, and your mind will be blown. You do not need LSD, although it will help.
But I want to counter that too. If you look at individually, if you go deep inside each person, there is a universe within us as well. So I remember seeing a book when you go deep inside like the cells and you see basically the same image that you see out of space. So the inner and outer space are connected. So even though we're a speck, but we're a wonderful speck. We're like a
We're a
marvelous
part.
speck that
We're a
includes.
part. We're a part of that groundlessness.
We're part of the whole, and the
It's the
whole
drop that contains
infuses.
the ocean at the same time, I think.
Yes, the whole infuses each of the parts. We are
That's right.
we are in the cosmos, and the cosmos is in us.
Yes,
that's it.
yes.
That's it.
And this is precisely why interpretations and attempts to explain away people's problems is not enough for many people to deeply heal. This is what Rank brought in also. Again, the person-to-person soup of that relationship is so critical because it's allowing a person to experience their struggle, not just talk about it or report about it.
Yes, and the word experience, very important.
Thereby reoccupy, literally and figuratively, parts of their embodiment of the struggle that have been cut off.
So that's right. So Rank created experiential therapy, not only humanistic therapy, not only existential therapy, not only leadership development, not only, he was actually the first psychoanalytic movie critic of all things in 1914, but he created experiential therapy. He said the feeling that emerges between the I and the thou. He actually used the Buber terms, I and thou, which is quite something that Freud never did. Freud always advocated an I-it relationship because the patient was an it and he was the doctor treating a patient. Rank actually introduced I-thou relationships into psychotherapy, which today is relatively well accepted and common, and even a few psychoanalysts are willing to do it. Not many, they're still on the margins, and he was so advanced. In so many ways, he was a century ahead of his time. My new book will show that Otto Rank was talking and doing things that today we are just discovering.
Exactly.
as if no one had ever thought about it before. So it's a tragedy that the psychoanalyst canceled him. That is an absolutely apt term. In German, the word is totgeschwiegen, which means death by silence, basically. In other words, they refused to read him, they refused to quote him, and if anybody ever mentioned his name, they would have to attach the adjective psychotic or mentally ill to his name. Therefore, he was forbidden. And this really harmed the psychoanalytic cause. And today, sadly, it has fallen in reputation in universities. It is not even taught in most universities, except perhaps as one module in a history of psychology course. They have lost their prestige. So many books have been written about the bad behavior of many analysts, including Jung, Ernest Jones, who wrote the 3-volume biography of Freud, had really bad behavior with his patients. I will just leave it to your imagination. Jacques Lacan, leading psychoanalytic figure today, was well known for abusing his female patients. And so it has a legacy that is dark, but still there's light in it because there are a few brave souls, some of whom Kirk is good friends with, have seen that they took the wrong path. And now they are getting closer to the existential humanistic psychology, although they are still on the margins. These folks are pushed out by the mainstream. It's tragic.
Yeah.
Freud today is read by literary critics or by students of marketing or
Well,
entertainment. He is not considered an influential figure anymore in psychotherapy.
I think that's right, but in all fairness, psychology as a field has become more medicalized and mechanized also, which is opposing all forms of depth psychology as it moves toward a neuroscientific behavioral sort of model. But that is, I do, like you say, Bob, I think that's shifting to some degree, and there are some pioneers who are really beginning to see the value of seeing more of the whole person rather than just parts of people or just the external. Robert Stolero might be one example in psychoanalysis.
Yeah, he's one,
broadening.
There are very few, and honestly, I think I can count them on the fingers of my two hands. The number of people I know who are comfortable with even talking about a word like the will. That is not a word that is acceptable in the mainstream psychoanalytic circles. It's actually laughed at and said ridiculous, doesn't exist. We don't have anything to do with something as mystical as the will. While Irwin Yalom and Rollo May, and Ronk, of course, and William James all said that the will is a fundamental center of the human soul. It is the soul. In fact, it's simply another name for it.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to put Otto Rank back on the map. That's what you are doing, and I want to really thank you from the bottom of my heart. So I just want to make sure that I mention all of you. So Robert Kramer, you're one of the organizers. You're a professor of psychoanalysis and management and leadership. And Schneider, of course, psychology psychotherapist. And we also have Siebrecht Vanhooren, who was not able to come, Siebrecht Vanhooren. So he's a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist. But it was the power of the three musketeers or three amigos, right, who are bringing back into focus the amazing, outstanding work of Otto Rank. And again, thank you so much. I am very much myself looking forward to it next month, and we'll gladly attend. And I think it's also fascinating that there's a moment that we can also discuss things. There's open discussion involved as well. So I'd like to point that out to anyone who just like afraid of just a lecture. No, it's interactive. It's what Otto Rank would have done in his own webinar if he had organized it. So that's wonderful.
And Arash, if I could just mention quickly, it is sponsored mainly by our Existential Humanistic Institute, which can be accessed at ehinstitute.org. And you can find out more about the conference at that website.
November 4th and November 5th. It's 2 days. Right. It's completely online through Zoom. And thank you so much for being here on Arash's World. Thank you for promoting it. I fully promote it wholeheartedly. I've sent it to all my friends as well, and hope a lot of people attend because it is important. It is something that really personally resonates with me, and I hope more people do. But again, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you, Arash. Otto Rank is tanned and rested and ready to go.
And coming back to life. So he was silenced to death, but now he's having a rebirth. Hopefully.
Yes.
Yes.
We hope so.
Yeah, we are bringing him back to life.
That's it.
Mathew Fox, one of our speakers, one of the great theologians of the 20th and 21st century, will be speaking on Rank, whom he considers to be, he calls him a saint. I think that may be a little bit of
that's about right. That's
excess,
about
right. But he is Mathew has published 40 books and is sold millions of copies, and he's world renowned, and he's going to be one of our speakers. And he wrote the foreword to my new book.
Yes, he did.
Thank you so much.
Much appreciation for the opportunity here.
Thank you.